I used to think I was brave. In the summer, I'd go out with the boys and take charge of our little expeditions into the forests around our town. We pretended to be archaeologists uncovering lost tombs, fighting off mummies and mutant vampire bats. By the time I was 12, there wasn't a tree I hadn't climbed or a boy in school I hadn't tussled with. I'd always come home with scraped knees, skinned elbows, dirt and grass stains on my sneakers, and burrs stuck to the hems of my jeans. My mom and dad would just roll their eyes and smile because I was their wild, precious daughter. I'm pretty sure I was the only girl in my class who didn't scream when Ben Howlitz brought one of his dad's tarantula specimens for show and tell. I mean, the thing was dead and behind glass. I was always the first to take a dare. I couldn't stand the thought of anyone thinking I was just some girly girl because I wouldn't climb the water tower or walk through the graveyard at midnight to touch the statue that was supposedly cursed. I never told my parents about those escapades unless I actually got hurt. I think I had to go to the hospital 4 times before elementary school was finished. They were always furious, but I just bide my time until I could start up again. I kept on like that, with fear and guilt always in my periphery, until my second year of middle school. We were in Miss Newman's English class. It was July, and we were reading The Turn of the Screw. About halfway through, we got bored and started talking about ghost stories. Miss Newman told us about the Victorian tradition of reading a ghost story on Christmas Eve. She asked if we knew any. Someone brought up Casper, and we all made fun of him for reading kids' stuff. One girl, whose parents were lax, brought up some R-rated movies she'd seen. Terriel Stone mentioned Imar James, because of course she did. And then Lee Howards, one of my closest friends, asked if we knew the story of the McKenna house. He said it like he was winding up to give us all the juicy details. His eyes narrowed, his lips quirking into a smirk. His dad patrolled around there a lot, and he thought he could give us all nightmares. But Miss Newman shut him down. She didn't yell, she rarely had to. She just snapped her head around, looked at him down the bony beak of her nose, and said, "No. We will not be talking about that house in this classroom. Do you understand?" Lee did. Of course, he did. And he shut up. Most of us were scared of Miss Newman, with her dark eyes, pointy nose, gray hair, and thin fingers. She had this classically stern, unlikable teacher aura, like the villain in a story about magic orphans or fairy gardens. And she hated that house with a passion. She lived close to it, actually, in one of 3 houses at the bottom of the hill it sat on. We figured she'd probably been there and seen it all go down. I asked her about it once, right in front of everyone. I'd never considered that someone could be furious without raising their voice. But the way she said, "It's all stories. Now get back to your seat," and the way her dark eyes punched holes through me, it made me feel like she was about to slap me. She scared me. She was the only adult I'd ever met who could make me feel small, stupid, and well, childish. And I hated her for it. I made her my nemesis because a kid like me had to have one. Even though I doubt she ever gave me a second thought outside of school. Still, I was fed up with her attitude, and I saw my chance to have some fun. So after class ended, I cornered Lee. "Well," I told him, "we're going to check out the house." His eyes lit up with a big, mischievous smirk. "Hell yeah," he said. "I'm in." Of course, I dragged my brother, Grady, into it too. Grady and I had a relationship that was, to put it lightly, a mess. Back then, I was so full of fire, and he wasn't. He wasn't a risk-taker like I was. He was sort of an island, someone who sat on the sidelines, reading, building models, or watching The Muppet Show. He didn't live like I did, and back then, I thought that meant he wasn't living at all. I was obsessed with being strong and tough, and to me, he was just weak. So, I bullied him. I told myself I was just toughening him up, getting a rise out of him, making him mad, pushing him to take risks. I knew better. I knew he was just shy and sensitive, but I kept going. It's a wonder he didn't hate me. Maybe he did. I don't know. Sometimes, when it's late and I can't sleep, I tell myself that he did, over and over, until I get too fed up to do anything but sleep. So yeah, I dragged him into it. I cornered him after school, put my arm around his shoulders, and laid it on thick. He actually put up a fight, which surprised me. He went on about how, despite the rumors, not many people actually knew what had happened up there. There could be traps, or old, broken drug paraphernalia waiting to stick us if we touched the wrong thing in the dark. Or there could be squatters, and who knew what they might do. He finished by saying, and if the floor breaks and I break my leg, you'll get in so much trouble. Looking back, he was actually pretty convincing. But I was too fired up to let anyone sway me. I rushed ahead, told him to stuff it, that we were going, and that it would be good for him, all that crap. And he just wilted under me. I didn't care. I wanted to stick it to Miss Newman, my parents, and every other well-meaning adult and condescending teenager who had ever told me to stay away. The years of hearing the story had desensitized me in a way, and also hyped me up. I had to see if it was true. The story went like this, more or less. The McKennas were a wealthy family from New York who bought the land in 1976. By 1978, they had a house built and moved in. The husband's name was Jared, and the wife was Sandra. They were both quiet, reserved people. Jared was a short, stout man who rarely left his wife's side. Sandra was tall, sallow, and her skin had the color of unbaked bread. Though they were charitable and kind to anyone they met during their lonely evening walks by the lake or on their rare trips to a restaurant, they were fragile, not normal. Especially Sandra, who would sometimes show up at school plays and talent shows but could never stay until the end before leaving in tears. She was also known to sometimes catch children by the arm and stare at them with wet, dull eyes until they pulled away and ran. Acting like that, it was no surprise that rumors started spreading. The adults whispered that she had been in and out of asylums her whole life, and that she had smothered her own baby during an episode of postpartum psychosis. The kids told each other she was a child snatcher, a witch looking for her next meal, or maybe something even worse. A woman my mom knew from church bumped into Jared one evening as he was leaving the town's antique store. He stumbled, and the item he was carrying fell from his hands. My mom's friend, being a decent person, went to pick it up and saw it was definitely a book on the occult. She never told my mom what was on the cover exactly, only that it was vulgar and utterly horrid. Eventually, as the rumors grew and people grew colder toward them, the McKennas stopped leaving their house. Without any new incidents to stoke the fire, the talk eventually turned to newer things to be upset about, and the McKennas slipped into ghost story by flashlight territory, where they stayed. Then, one blue-gray night in July, when the air was thick with gnats and the wind was cool, the police received a call from Jared. He was in tears, begging them to come quickly. "Something's happened to my wife," he said. "It all went wrong. Everything's wrong. She's dying. You have to help us." And so they did. 3 or 4 police cars went squealing off into the night, up the dirt road on the fringes of town, to the McKennas' quaint little house. When they got there, they could hear screaming and sobbing from inside the foyer. When they busted down the door, they found Jared in the process of dragging his wife's body across the floor. She was white, turning yellow from blood loss. One leg was hanging on by a nerve cluster, nearly torn off at the thigh, and her belly and privates were mauled. A proper autopsy later revealed that some parts of her were missing. Of course, they arrested Jared. The man was a babbling, drooling, screaming wreck who could only say, "I'm sorry, Sandra." The police found a museum's worth of occult artifacts throughout the house, so it wasn't much of a stretch for people to assume he had killed his wife as part of some dark ritual. After everything, the house was left to rot. But some people say that on clear, blue, quiet nights, when the wind is cool and the gnats are flitting, you can hear Sandra's ghost staggering to and fro inside, calling for her husband to join her. Obviously, elements of the story kept changing. Sometimes her body was headless, other times, she was the one dragging him. The most common version when I was growing up was that the police found the two of them alive, wrapped in bloody robes, standing over a baby or a kid they had just made a meal of. I've spent a long time going over what evidence I could find. I have a theory I'm pretty sure of, but I'm going to save it for the end. I want to go over what happened to us first, before I lose my nerve. And if I think I'm fine after, then I'll tell you. Back then, I heard about all those awful, gruesome things. And although I did have nightmares, I still felt this giddiness at the idea of going there, of delving into the unknown like an old-timey pulp hero. What better place to test myself, right? So we snuck out at 11 p.m., I thought it would be cool to explore the haunted house at midnight. We brought our backpacks stuffed full of horror comics, candy, Halloween in July, flashlights, and my little flip phone. The house was on the opposite side of town, down a lonely little dirt drive walled in by woods. Grady had brought our dad's Kodak camera, which was pretty much his by then, and by the time we got there, he had already taken about a dozen pictures. When I asked him why, he stuck his nose in the air and said, "Because it looks pretty at night, and I want to enjoy it." I said something snarky back to him. Then I pushed him. He got up and shoved me, and then we were racing the rest of the way. He was so quick. He always has been. In the end, I had to trip him as he made it into the driveway of the house. Then I twisted his arm behind his back until his laughter stopped and the begging started. I was such a creep. I probably smiled when I did it. Things were quiet for a bit afterward. Lee called to say he was on his way, so that gave us some time to look around the outside of the place. I'd been hearing stories about that house since I was little. Our town was big, with forests on all sides, tall mountains, and a nice blue lake. There were dozens of weird places you could still visit: the old rectory, the museum, the biggest library in the county, the abandoned wharf out by the lake, the little stone circle near the hiking trail. But those places were charming, you know. Quaint, like an old Halloween die-cut or a Ray Bradbury story. They were places our parents approved of, places where tourists went. They had a history you could make family-friendly, one that wouldn't taint our little child brains and turn us into witches or drug dealers or whatever. The adults didn't like talking about it. If I asked, they'd just say it wasn't a place for little girls to go playing in. And if I nagged them enough, they'd get antsy or angry and tell me to go find some other place to horse around at. Sometimes, they'd crouch down, look me dead in the eye, and say something like, "Some bad things happened up there." Okay, some very bad things. And they'd use these serious voices, as if we'd figure it out, and then they'd leave it at that. As if saying that wouldn't make me and every other bored tween and teen want to go have a look. And people did go have a look. But nobody ever went in, at least, not farther than the mudroom, which had a closed door at the other end. I don't think that counted. Not that I'd actually seen the place outside of a few pictures. After someone a few classes above me tried to break a window, the place ended up being patrolled by one of the policemen, usually one who looked suitably scary to a kid. Probably picked like that on purpose. Items taken from the house were treated like good luck charms or priceless museum pieces. Toby Nash had a boot he'd taken from the mudroom, and he treated that disgusting thing like a Picasso painting or something. So, with all that said, when I actually saw the place, it lived up to my expectations. It was a tall, thin house covered in narrow windows, almost like the kind medieval soldiers would fire crossbows through. The top was all green gables that were as straight and sharp as knife tips, with a few old brick chimneys sticking out here and there. An awning went around the whole place between the first and second floors, and everything except the shutters and the roof was painted a light blue, the kind of blue you see in nurseries. I remember the last rays of the sun bouncing off the dark glass and the cotton candy inferno of the evening sky overhead, and thinking, it looks like a fairy tale house. And yeah, it did. But it was more like a fairy tale house a long time after the happily ever after, when the prince and princess had moved away to bigger and better things and left their little cottage behind to rot in the enchanted forest. Grady was actually the one who got over it first. It was the clicking of his camera that snapped me out of it. I remember being glad he was too fixated on the house to see the expression on my face, even if it was only for a moment. We followed a half-wrecked stone pathway through a tangled mess of a garden that led up to the little front porch, Grady snatching the Polaroids that fell from his camera all the while. There wasn't any graffiti, but I could see a few places where people had dug out a chip of wood from the already gouged-up front porch. The door itself was really scratched up, too, but the knob still worked, and it wasn't locked or bolted. I said something like, "We should just go in. Maybe we can hide and scare Lee when he comes by." I didn't mean a word of it. Grady gave me a look. He was really good at mimicking our parents' facial expressions, but they never worked on me. It was hard to take someone smaller and slighter than you seriously, especially when you've seen them cry, when you've made them cry. Still, that time, I relented. Some little need in my mind, told me not to go in without someone else with me. Lee was bigger than Grady by a fair margin. He played a lot of sports, and I knew he'd bring a baseball bat or something with him because he always did whenever we explored a new place. So, we did some looking while we waited. It ended up being only about 5 minutes, but Grady got a bunch of shots of the actual house while I took a look at the garden. If you didn't look at it, and I mean really look at it, if you just let your brain file it away as part of the house, then you wouldn't notice all the little details. Like the doughy white clusters of fungus sprouting up everywhere, even on the flowers. Or how the roses weren't roses because they were too tall, and they had big, bloated bulbs that weren't the right kind of red, and their thorns were too long and black. Or the bird bath, half sunken into the ground and all tangled with ivy, where you could still see a carving of a naked woman with a hummingbird head holding the pincers of a giant scorpion with a man's head. I bet Lee would have thought some of that stuff was cool. And maybe it sounds cool to you. But there, in all that stillness, with the humidity weighing everything down and the shadows growing out from the grass and the trees, it really wasn't. Eventually, Lee came panting and gasping up the trail. Grady asked him if he was okay. I gave him crap for being late. And then, it was time. I didn't really wait to open it. I just did. I knew I'd look scared if I hesitated. I knew, in some deeper way, that I'd just give up and walk away if I let myself think about it too much. I had to be the strong one. The personal ethos of a tomboy tween. God help me. The door was heavy, and it didn't make a sound when it swung in. The air that came from inside was cold, dusty, and damp. It was dark, but we'd brought some pretty powerful flashlights. The door opened up into the mudroom, which wasn't much to look at, just a bunch of crusty coats and old boots, one pair missing a shoe, a really moldy rug, and another door. I got this overwhelming sinking feeling when I saw that door. This understanding that we were about to go somewhere real, for lack of a better word. There hadn't been another place in town that was off limits to us. And now we were someplace that was actually forbidden to us, someplace even the adults didn't go. We all knew, at least I think we did, that we'd get in more trouble than we'd ever been in if we got caught or if anyone found out later. It should have been exhilarating, but it made my stomach turn. Still, I made myself take the first step. I'd brought a few things with me, some wires, a hammer, a screwdriver, and a skeleton key that my dad kept in his junk drawer. Obviously, none of us knew how to pick a lock, but I was ready to try something if I had to. But there was no need. Because there was a key in the lock, a little silver key with a big purple tassel that was so grimy and dusty, it looked like some kind of mummified dead spider. Toby hadn't even mentioned a key. None of the older kids did. I told Lee and Grady about it, going on about what total lying wimps the other people must have been. As I reached out and turned the key, there was a deep, resonant click that echoed through the walls and into the depths of the house. The door popped open as if on springs, and a rush of cold, musty air hit us, like the house had let go of a breath it had been holding. I remember how we all gasped at the sound. Lee tried to whistle, and Grady reached out to take my hand, but then he stopped. He just hugged himself instead. I was glad he kept his hands to himself because mine had gone wet and clammy in what felt like a second. We filed in single file. The sounds of crickets and wind in the trees gave way to the creaks and groans of the house, and what I thought was the scratching of mice in the walls. The foyer looked like a smaller version of one of those old plantation mansions, thin white pillars, marble floors, 2 doorways leading off to other wings, and a tall staircase curling up to the second floor. We argued a bit over what to do. Lee wanted to go upstairs. I wanted to find the nearest room, snag something, and leave. But Grady, in a moment of bravery that totally caught me by surprise, said it would be better if we went through all the rooms, starting from the bottom. We'd be legends, hometown heroes, like Tom Sawyer or something. We'd have pictures to prove it, too. The older kids would stop looking at us like we were babies, and kids our age would worship the ground we walked on. He looked like he was falling into a daydream while he laid it out for us. It made sense. A bullied kid might go pretty far to get at least a little respite from everything, at least outside of home. We went left first. The echoing marble gave way to creaky old wood, proper floors for a haunted house, right. Our flashlight beams cut across the ground like a little boat on a big, dark sea, full of shadowy little islands you could just barely make out. I hoped to find old blood or tape outlining something, but all I saw was dust and shadows. We ended up in the living room first, and by my thinking at the time, all my worries that the house would leave us cold faded away. It was a big room, but there was so much clutter that it looked smaller. There were a couple of chairs draped with sheets, a ratty, overstuffed couch without one, a little fireplace, another door at the far end, stacks of paperbacks and newspapers, charts, folders, and babies. Not real ones, figurines, statues. But that didn't make me less creeped out. There were hundreds of them, sitting on top of stacks, cluttering the coffee tables, lined up in front of books on the shelves. Boys and girls of every race, from every period. Plastic dollar store-looking junk and antiques, realistic and cartoony. It gave me a thrill. Grady started taking pictures almost immediately. Lee went to the stacks, and I went to the bookshelves. For the first few rows, it was all romance novels, books on color theory, and architecture. But it didn't take long for the selection to change. It went from Two Sirs with Love and the Art of Color to The Expectant Mother and Motherhood 101. The last bookcase was empty. We looked through the rest of the place, but there wasn't much else to interest us. I pocketed the creepiest baby figure I could find, a big-headed, big-lipped thing with glass eyes. Lee swiped an old magazine without looking at it. And Grady took more pictures. Then we went for the door past the fireplace. The hallway behind it was cramped, full of boxes and other things under yellowing sheets. The wallpaper was torn all to hell, and there were holes punched in the drywall, with bits of debris scattered across the floor. There were 2 doors on either side, so I took the left one and Lee took the right. Grady's interest was fixed on the holes in the wall. He was taking pictures of the insides, so he stayed behind. The room I'd chosen turned out to be completely empty. Just my luck. I waited a few seconds because I didn't want to seem like I'd picked the dud room, then went to see if Lee had found anything. I'd taken maybe 2 steps when I heard Grady gasp. I ran out and found him with his back pressed against the wall, away from where he'd been standing. His eyes were wide, and the camera was shaking in his hands. He was staring at the largest hole in the wall, and I knew he must have seen something even before he said it. He told me he'd seen what he thought were big, fat maggots writhing around a green ball. He'd even snapped a photo. Problem was, his hands were shaking so much that the camera fell into the hole. I humored him, shining my light inside. I even poked my head in partway. No maggots, no green ball, no camera, just slick wood and a few wisps of fiberglass. Admittedly, I didn't linger. I thought it was just a cramped little alcove between the joists, but it was actually bigger than that. I could reach out my hand and only barely graze the sheet insides. It was like a thin, dark extra hallway that had been walled over. The air in there was damp, like the guts of the house had held onto a bit of every storm that had ever weathered it. It was cold, too, way colder than the rest of the house. And when my fingertips touched the sheathing, they came away slimy, like I'd picked up a slug, with a few extra splinters. After I took my hand out, I made sure to give Grady my best unimpressed mom look. He wasn't the only one who could do that. Then I went to check on Lee. After that, we returned to the foyer and checked the door on the right. It led to the kitchen, and the only interesting things we found were a pan of roast so old it had ossified and a cookbook with recipes to encourage male fertility, which made Lee and me giggle like morons for a good minute. From there, it was on to the second floor. The stairs leading up groaned every few seconds. Grady asked if we could please go single file and take it slowly. We did, though I teased him a little about it. The upstairs felt different. When we reached the top, it was kind of cold but humid. The air stuck to my lungs, and I broke out in a cold sweat before I knew it. Poor Grady had to reach for his inhaler for a minute, and Lee started coughing like he had consumption. It stank, too. I've been an EMT for about 5 years now, and in my opinion, there are 2 kinds of smells. The gut-churningly bad acute kinds, like when a person has a seizure and loses control of their bowels, and the creeping, chronic kind of smell, like in a burn ward or the ICU. Places that have a smell, and then an undersmell. Something all the antiseptic and industrial bleach can't totally wipe away. It's the kind of smell that's, what's the word? It insinuates itself. Creeps up on you and tickles your brain until you realize what it is, and then you can't stop noticing it. That's what the whole upstairs of the McKenna house smelled like. Like something curdling, fermenting, growing, just on the edge of notice. No wonder we all started feeling so sick. The actual layout of the upstairs was odd. 2 long hallways on either side, the left had 2 rooms, and the right looked like it had only 1, but I couldn't tell. I decided we'd save that one for last. The first room we entered was the bathroom. It looked about how you'd imagine. The second was the bedroom, shag carpeting gone ratty with time, a big nightstand covered in photo albums, a few bottles of prescription antidepressants, a closet without a door, and a king-sized bed stripped of its covers and sheets. There was a big duvet on one side, and on the wall right beside it was this huge gash in the drywall, taller than me and nearly as wide. My brother went over and started taking pictures, though he had to step back after a minute because the smell was making him queasy. Lee actually wanted to go in and see where it went. I told him he was too fat to fit, and Grady butted in before we could start a fistfight in a haunted house, telling Lee he saw lots of rusty nails sticking out everywhere, which wasn't true. I felt Lee's eyes burning into the back of my neck as we moved on. but I knew he wouldn't try anything until later, if at all. I mean, he just took my brother at his word, and he didn't usually do that. Maybe he was just trying to sound macho, waiting for us to give him permission to let it go, if that makes any sense. Normally, if that kind of tension broke out between us, we'd snipe back and forth and maybe get in a proper fight. But we'd been marinating in the atmosphere of that damn house for about half an hour. We kept starting to talk and then second-guessing ourselves before the words came out. So we stood there in awkward silence until Grady asked if we were going back. Obviously, I heard the words more than the worried tone and took it as a jibe. I scoffed and told him we had one more room left, and then maybe we could leave. We got halfway down the right hall when Lee got his revenge by jostling me. I stumbled, reached out, and put a hand on the wall to steady myself. My palm hit a doorknob. It's hard to describe the feeling that came over me when I actually turned and looked where I put my hand. It was like looking at a page in a book when you're beyond tired. My vision got all splotchy, and I felt this greasy feeling in my gut. I blinked, and all I could see was plaster and mold. Then I blinked again, and there was a door. And then, whatever it was, went away. My hand was on the knob, and I could taste chalk in the air. Looking back, it should have been obvious what had happened, but I think I legitimately thought it was a trick of the light or my mind being addled from the awful stink and dust. I bet you anything that if I had actually looked before trying to open the door, Lee and Grady would have been staring at me in the wall with slack jaws and buggy eyes. It was locked, so I took out the crowbar and broke it open. The room turned out to be the study, and it was quiet. Not a thing moving. No rats in the walls, just the creaking of the floors and the whistling of the wind outside. That's how it seemed, at least. It was a big room, but there was so much clutter that it looked smaller. There were a couple of chairs draped with sheets, a ratty, overstuffed couch without one, a little fireplace, another door at the far end, stacks of paperbacks and newspapers, charts, folders, and babies. Not real ones, figurines, statues. But that didn't make me less creeped out. There were hundreds of them, sitting on top of stacks, cluttering the coffee tables, lined up in front of books on the shelves. Boys and girls of every race, from every period. Plastic dollar store-looking junk and antiques, realistic and cartoony. It gave me a thrill. Grady started taking pictures almost immediately. Lee went to the stacks, and I went to the bookshelves. For the first few rows, it was all romance novels, books on color theory, and architecture. But it didn't take long for the selection to change. It went from Two Sirs with Love and the Art of Color to The Expectant Mother and Motherhood 101. The last bookcase was empty. We looked through the rest of the place, but there wasn't much else to interest us. I pocketed the creepiest baby figure I could find, a big-headed, big-lipped thing with glass eyes. Lee swiped an old magazine without looking at it. And Grady took more pictures. Then we went for the door past the fireplace. The hallway behind it was cramped, full of boxes and other things under yellowing sheets. The wallpaper was torn all to hell, and there were holes punched in the drywall, with bits of debris scattered across the floor. There were 2 doors on either side, so I took the left one and Lee took the right. Grady's interest was fixed on the holes in the wall, he was taking pictures of the insides, so he stayed behind. The room I'd chosen turned out to be completely empty. Just my luck. I waited a few seconds because I didn't want to seem like I'd picked the dud room, then went to see if Lee had found anything. I'd taken maybe 2 steps when I heard Grady gasp. I ran out and found him with his back pressed against the wall, away from where he'd been standing. His eyes were wide, and the camera was shaking in his hands. He was staring at the largest hole in the wall, and I knew he must have seen something even before he said it. He told me he'd seen what he thought were big, fat maggots writhing around a green ball. He'd even snapped a photo. Problem was, his hands were shaking so much that the camera fell into the hole. I humored him, shining my light inside. I even poked my head in partway. No maggots, no green ball, no camera, just slick wood and a few wisps of fiberglass. Admittedly, I didn't linger. I thought it was just a cramped little alcove between the joists, but it was actually bigger than that. I could reach out my hand and only barely graze the sheet insides. It was like a thin, dark extra hallway that had been walled over. The air in there was damp, like the guts of the house had held onto a bit of every storm that had ever weathered it. It was cold, too, way colder than the rest of the house. And when my fingertips touched the sheathing, they came away slimy, like I'd picked up a slug, with a few extra splinters. After I took my hand out, I made sure to give Grady my best unimpressed mom look. He wasn't the only one who could do that. Then I went to check on Lee. After that, we returned to the foyer and checked the door on the right. It led to the kitchen, and the only interesting things we found were a pan of it was a big room, with pictures covering every inch of the wall, cheap-looking bookshelves filled to capacity, a gouged and ransacked desk, a few bins, a clawfoot bathtub that wasn't hooked up to anything and looked old enough to be in a museum, and 2 statues, one short, one very tall, both under sheets. I bet if we'd looked at the floor, we'd have seen marks in the dust around the taller statue. Or at least we'd have noticed how that one wasn't fuzzy with cobwebs like the others. Instead, we were distracted by everything else. At some point, there had been a long folding table, like the kind they have for book fairs, against the far wall. But time and the weight of all the crap on it had been too much for the cheap legs. It had fallen on one side and dumped everything across the floor. The pictures weren't good things for kids to be looking at. Not at all. A circle of men standing around a smiling woman whose belly had bloomed like an orchid to show the grinning baby inside. A very detailed female anatomical chart that looked like it was made in Victorian times. A giant hermaphroditic thing with 2 heads. Things like that. I think Grady was the only one of us who wasn't creeped out by those things. He took pictures of most of them. I think you can check them out later yourself. Aside from those, there were periodic tables, star charts, Norman Rockwell postcards, sketches of children and babies in sunny meadows or strollers or whatever else, photocopies of old medieval tapestries, suns with people's faces. It felt like finding that secret room in a serial killer's house, with all the pictures and newspapers. There were books, too. Stuff like The Female Body, Inside and Out or From Clay to Life. Some were so old they were growing mold. Some were in Japanese or German or some other language. Some didn't even have titles or authors. It was Grady who figured out what we were looking at. I wasn't much of a reader, much less a fantasy reader. He looked around for a few moments, brows furrowed, just like our mom when she was editing her latest design, before his eyes widened. In the same tone he'd used when we took him to see the whales at SeaWorld, he said, "I think this is an alchemist's lab." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I pretended I did anyway so I wouldn't have to hear him wind himself up into a rant. It didn't matter to me, or at least not at the time. He went off, snapping picture after picture until his satchel was full and he had to hand it off to me. I actually took them without messing with him. I mean, the more proof we had, the less the other kids could deny us, right? Lee was at the back of the room, looking at a weird lab setup made entirely of glass. He was staring at his reflection in the beakers and snickering to himself, which meant I had nothing else to do but poke around a bit more. Eventually, my eyes landed on a little wooden chair with 2 books stacked on the seat. Pretty as can be. One was thick and water-stained, the one on top was barely a step above a pamphlet, The New Age of Incarnation, or How the Great Work May Gift the Barren and Sell Your Seed and Follow Ground. I didn't know what the word incarnation meant, so my attention got snagged by the other one. And before I'd even really thought about it, I'd taken it. It was a thin book with this awful lithograph cover, a woman in pilgrim clothes kneeling in a field full of babies' arms, all swaying in the wind like stalks of grain. It was dog-eared, full of bookmarks, and covered in writing, red and blue pen going over every sentence until it looked like a weird 3D eye trick puzzle. It's been years, but I've never been able to find out anything about it. Who published it? Who wrote it? It has virtually no online presence, except for a few people on forums who've mentioned owning a copy or seeing it somewhere. I bet anything the other books in there were like that, too, antiques only real practicing alchemists would know, not strip mall spiritualists. Regardless, the place was too much for me. I'd found my limits. I was done. I wanted to go, and I said as much. And that's when Lee saw his opening and pounced. He'd definitely been working up a good head of steam since the bathroom. He laid into me, saying I was chickening out before we'd gone through the whole house. He finished it off by saying, "I bet you're just going to run crying to mommy and run straight into a cop and get us all in trouble, all 'cause you were too chicken to go into a room. You ever been so angry that you felt like your skin was on fire? Like you wanted to cry, scream, and roar, but your mind couldn't decide which?" I stood there for what felt like a minute, literally shaking with rage. I pushed the fear and uneasiness aside, and it made me feel like I'd just eaten all my Halloween candy in one go. Lee, to his credit, realized he'd gone too far and wisely started running. He got out of the room and tried to head down the hall to the stairs, but I cut him off. So he ran back down the hall to the last room. I caught up to him before he could get any farther, grabbed him by the hair, and started laying into him. The wood groaned, things crunched under our feet, and I didn't even think to look where we were going until we tripped and fell. 1 second I'm cutting through the air, the next, I'm among brittle, crunchy, cold things that break under me, rip through my clothes, and shred my skin. Something goes through my arm while my hand plunges into something cold and mushy. I let out this disgusting squawk and pushed Lee away so I could get to my feet. I braced myself on the floor, and my other hand hit something fuzzy and cold. That's when I noticed the smell. This horrible, sour-sweet smell that burrowed into my nose. I dropped my flashlight earlier, but Lee hadn't. I didn't want to see. I already knew what I was lying in. Hot summers spent near highways and in culverts, and owning 4 mutts with black holes for stomachs, had acquainted me with the smell and feel of roadkill. The light came on before I could get up and tell him to stop. They were everywhere. Birds and mice, cats, but mostly, I saw a few dogs and maybe an elk, too, all rotting and melting into a knee-high swamp of mold and sewage. Basically, I saw the flashlight beam glinting off a dozen wide, dead black eyes, the off-white of teeth and fangs, the crayon drawings on the wall, the knocked-over, well-used toys dotted about, all the filth like little islands. And then the massive hole in the far wall, stretching from floor to ceiling. The smell wouldn't let up. There was something behind the rot, something like petrified flesh, raw meat. I bent over, trying to keep myself from throwing up. When I did, I saw something lying on top of the mess, stuck to it with biofilm. It was a Polaroid. A Polaroid of an old wooden floor without any dust. Some joists with little wisps of fiberglass still sticking to them. And a green ball gripped by 5 fat, white fingers, each ending in a black hook. That's when I understood. I thought it would have been fun, our spooky little quest, just something to do in a town that had started to bore us. You don't really know a horror story is real until you're in the middle of one. The feeling that came with that realization was awful. It felt like I'd been walking across the road, my feet firmly on stable ground, and then, bam, I'd stepped out into open air. I stood up feeling like the world was tilted on its side, my hands sticky with green rot, fur, and maggots. I turned to scream, to call out to Lee and Grady, to tell them we needed to get out of there right now. And then, down the hall, I heard my brother start to scream. It was an awful sound. High-pitched, throat-splitting, helpless. He'd broken an arm once because I'd pushed him out of a tree I dared him to climb. I'd scared him hundreds of times in October and out of it. I'd let my roughhousing get out of control more than once. And he'd never made a sound even a little like that. He went on and on. Something fell with a crash. I heard him start to run, then stop just as quickly. And then there wasn't anything. No more screaming. No more crashing. Just Lee's crying and my own heartbeat. I knew we'd have to get out of there. The hole in the wall was behind me. I could feel it at my back, waiting. I think that's what got me to move, that nebulous image of something shooting out of the darkness, pulling me down into the rot, and dragging me away. There wasn't much real planning on my part. All I knew was that I needed to get my brother and run. I imagined taking the stairs 3 at a time, dragging the boys by their arms, bursting through the front door, and running out into the night away from whatever lumbering ghoul was chasing us. I hauled Lee up and threw him onto solid ground. Then I got out, feeling maggots dying under my fingernails. We went to the door, threw it open, and stepped out into the darkness with only Lee's shaky little pocket of light to see by. I heard Grady before I saw him, and I didn't have time to even finish thinking I don't want to see him before he crawled out into the light. Every breath he took was wet, and his hands were red. What it had done to his face. God, I don't know how he could have seen us or heard us. I can't imagine how painful it must have been. He reached out to me, my little brother, the person I'd bullied and comforted and held as a baby, the one I'd promised my parents I would care for, gagging on his own blood. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. His hand fell. It was like watching in slow motion. And that's when I noticed the things on his back. 5 or 6 of them, maybe more. I was too shocked, they were too fast. But I caught a glimpse of red and white skin, lumpy heads with big wet mouths, fast little hands with long fingers like dental tools. They all fell off Grady when the light hit them, but I saw them scurrying around him where the light didn't reach, brushing at his clothes, tugging at his legs, making tiny, quiet little suckling sounds. Lee screamed, and maybe I did, too. I can't remember. I was just standing there, feeling like I was watching everything happen to someone else. Then the light was gone. Lee had turned around to run, which was stupid. There weren't any other rooms. The only window there was had been boarded up. It didn't even matter. He hadn't taken 2 steps before something came out of the room we had just been in. You've never seen a monster, a real one. It's been 2 decades, and I still haven't fully found a way to explain how seeing that thing come swaying into the light from out of the darkness felt, what it did to me. It was brain-searing. It was like being in freefall. It was like seeing something impossible and knowing it wasn't. It made my bladder give, my bowels loosen. It made me choke on bile and the scream that still wouldn't come. Imagine legs with no feet. Imagine red flesh on a body like a honeycomb for vulture bees. Imagine a mother spider with her body boiling with her babies, all jostling each other, rippling, going still like lake water. Imagine a big, swollen white head, all dusty and soft like rotting bread dough. Imagine that somebody tried to sculpt a baby's face onto it. Now imagine it looking down at you and cooing at you with a baby's happy little voice. That's what it was. It was worse than any accident you could see, any sickness you could treat, or wound you could suture. Seeing it cost me so much, my health for a good 10 years, my sobriety for nearly as long, my willingness to even be around children for longer than absolutely necessary. None of my family knows, though. I bet plenty of the old-timers in town do. Aside from you, the only people I've actually told were some friends at a college party when I was drunk and high out of my mind. And Miss Newman, she was the one who found me, choking on tears and snot, stinking like dead things and waste. She had been coming up the trail with the officer we'd snuck past. She yelled something when she saw me and Lee racing down. Then I heard her gasp as we got closer and she could smell us and see us. For me, there's nothing between hearing the baby's happy little voice coming out of that thing and feeling the night wind clawing at my cheeks. Miss Newman caught me when I fell. She didn't shake me or yell at me. She just spoke to me. Even though I couldn't hear anything, all I could hear was my brother's dead, over and over on a loop. I must have told her about Grady, or Lee did. I can't remember. I passed out pretty soon after. My little adventure was the talk of the town. I made the paper a few times, got talked to and yelled at by the police and my parents. Lee's dad came by and watched me for a while before he left. I barely talked to any of them. I spent a week in the hospital, then the remainder of that summer sitting in my bed doing nothing. I just sat there with my blankets wrapped around me, staring off at my TV or the wall, not seeing anything but what happened that night. I barely moved, sleeping until my body gave out or my parents made me take a sleeping pill. I didn't talk either. But I did have my brother's satchel. I'd forgotten that I'd taken it with me when I'd run, but I had. And it wasn't long before someone found the pictures. I'm sure some people here have told you some stories about me, but I'm also sure there aren't many who think that it was me who killed Grady. And those pictures are why. I kept them. Despite the smell and what they show and the fact that I can't even look at the filing cabinet they're in without it all coming back, I won't throw them out. They're Grady's pictures, and I can't just throw them away because they make me feel bad. They stay there. But you can take pictures of them, or I can make copies. The originals stay with me. They burned the house down. It took people a few years to actually do it. I remember one of my friends who's a firefighter told me the night they all went up there ready to torch it. It took them an hour to actually do it because he and his friends were certain, down to their souls, that the place wouldn't catch fire if they tried. They ended up having to leave. Some of them had fevers and headaches afterward. That's how it went for 6 more nights across 4 months. Just before we were expected to get a huge snowfall, a group of them decided to get sloshed and do it anyway. I'm told the place went up like a grease fire. It just kept burning even after the last of the supports turned to ash. I go up there sometimes during the day. The air is just one big black pit. I haven't seen anything grow there, and it's been more than a decade. And before you ask, and I can see you gearing up to, I don't know. I don't know if those things are gone. You wanted to know what I thought had happened to the McKennas. I think Sandra wanted children so badly that she and her husband turned to alchemy to fight their problems. And those things I saw that night, they were the result. Yeah, I have some sympathy for her. She was clearly very mentally ill, and the way she died was horrific. But I mean, she could have adopted, brought a kid into their lives that way. Instead, she and her husband, they cost my brother his life. I'll never get the chance to apologize for everything I did, for leaving him behind. He wouldn't have made it, but I should have done more instead of stepping on him on the way out.